What if the greatest secrets of human history aren't lost, but hidden? Beneath the windswept sands of Giza, a machine sleeps. Not a myth, not a metaphor, but a buried construct of metal and math. In 1993, Japanese archaeologist Dr. Sakuji Yoshimura stood at the feet of the Great Sphinx, holding ground-penetrating radar that began to hum with something strange. What the sensors revealed was not limestone or bedrock, but a massive geometric structure lying silent beneath the Sphinx's paws, metallic, engineered, 30 meters long. It was unlike anything recorded in Egypt's ancient past. Unknown alloys, hollow chambers, energy signatures that danced in unnatural rhythms, echoes of quantum equations not yet fully understood by modern physics. Dr. Yoshimura didn't just find an artifact. He found a question wrapped in science, sealed in stone, and whispered through time. But within 48 hours, the dig was over, his permits revoked, his team expelled, his findings classified. Egypt's authorities moved swiftly. Concrete was poured, and the site was closed to further investigation. It was as if history itself had been covered over with silence. Yet not all data was lost. Yoshimura had already transmitted his scans to colleagues in Japan. Independent metallurgists at Tokyo University analyzed the composition and were stunned. It included isotopes not found on Earth, precision that outmatched modern tools. It was a machine not only ahead of its time, but seemingly out of time. And it was still active. Electromagnetic pulses rippled from beneath the sand, steady, mathematical, unnatural. The machine, buried for thousands of years, was still humming, still watching, waiting. Attempts to publish the data were stonewalled. Academic journals balked at the implications. Peer reviewers whispered words like impossible. Research grants evaporated. Colleagues distanced themselves. And behind it all, pressure from governments and agencies, some documents suggest involvement by U.S. intelligence, worked to erase the story entirely. But what was it they feared? Was it the artifact itself, a technology older than human civilization, or the implications? That our ancestors may not have been alone in their genius. That knowledge might have once leapt ahead of its time, only to be buried again by the shifting sands of memory and power. Today, the machine remains entombed, silent beneath a monument that has watched over humanity for thousands of years. And still it emits patterns. Still it hums. We begin this journey not in certainty, but in silence. A silence enforced not by time, but by choice. In this 14-part series, we will walk the thin line between forgotten knowledge and deliberate erasure. We'll travel from deserts to jungles, from mountains to museums, where the edges of history blur into something more fragile, more elusive, more human. This is not a story of conspiracy. It's a story of memory and the forces that shape what we're allowed to remember. Because sometimes the past isn't lost. It's locked away. It began in stone, etched not with chisel or hammer, but with equations. In 1961, deep within the silence of Chile's Atacama Desert, American archaeologist Charles Berlitz uncovered something extraordinary. Thousands of carved stones scattered across a barren plateau. At first glance, they resembled ancient petroglyphs, but under closer scrutiny, they revealed something else entirely: mathematics, physics, star maps, blueprints for machines not yet built. These weren't artifacts of storytelling or worship. They were instruments of knowledge. Each stone bore inscriptions, spirals of numbers, geometric diagrams, chemical notations, scratched with a precision that suggested tools unknown to the period. Some stones displayed detailed depictions of atomic structures, others the periodic table, complete with elements only recently discovered by modern science. There were carvings of propulsion systems and what looked like quantum circuit diagrams. Berlitz wasn't just looking at art. He was staring at a scientific archive older than history itself. And then, as quietly as they had emerged, the stones were taken. The Chilean government seized the entire collection, declaring the site a restricted zone. Berlitz was banned from further research. His notes and samples were confiscated at the airport. Official reasoning cited cultural preservation, but unofficially something far more coordinated was underway. Independent physicists later gained access to photographs of the stones. What they found defied explanation. Some of the carved formulas described quantum mechanics theories not formally published until the 21st century. One stone showed an energy reactor design that used quantum tunneling principles, something even today remains theoretical. Who carved them? When? How could they have known? The carvings weren't random. They followed a structured logic, suggesting a civilization fluent in complex scientific reasoning. A people who had mapped the heavens, harnessed forces invisible to the eye, and documented their findings in stone that would last through time. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect was what lay beyond the science, a pattern. The stones seemed to be part of a larger system, each one a node in a vast network of knowledge. Together, they hinted at an integrated worldview where physics, astronomy, and technology were inseparable from philosophy and purpose. Berlitz tried to sound the alarm. He wrote to colleagues, he lectured, but his story was dismissed as fringe. The academic world had no room for ancient civilizations outpacing Newton or Einstein. His credibility unraveled. He died with his findings unpublished, the stones locked behind military fences. And so the Atacama stones remain out of reach, their meanings unstudied, their warnings unread. But their existence suggests something radical, that humanity may have known and then forgotten the deep structures of the universe, that science may not only be discovered, but rediscovered, and that intelligence, once awakened, does not always endure, but it does sometimes leave a trail. What if these stones were not just relics, but messages, not only to the future, but from a future once lived? And if we listened closely, could they still speak? It started with bones, buried deep beneath Argentine soil where time itself forgets to look. In 1880, geologist Dr. Carlos Amejano made a discovery that should have shattered the foundations of human history. While excavating the Monte Hermoso Formation near Buenos Aires, he unearthed human fossils embedded in rock layers over 25 million years old. Not primitive ancestors, not fragments of a distant lineage, fully modern human skeletons, intact, undeniable. But history, it seemed, wasn't ready. According to accepted timelines, anatomically modern humans emerged around 300,000 years ago. Yet here were bones indistinguishable from those of people alive today, found in strata predating that moment by over 24 million years. The implications were staggering. Either human beings had existed far longer than anyone believed, or there had been entire cycles of civilization wiped clean and forgotten. Amejano published his findings in a respected anthropological journal. For a brief moment, the world listened. Then came the silence. Within months, the article was retracted. Leading academic institutions in Europe challenged the data, not with counter-evidence, but with disbelief. Claims of contamination, accusations of flawed dating. No one could accept what the bones revealed. The timeline, they insisted, could not be wrong. But it wasn't just Amejano. British paleontologist Arthur Smith Woodward traveled to the site and confirmed the find. He discovered more fossils, tools, artifacts, objects suggesting a culture capable of crafting, thinking, shaping. His report was quietly classified by the British Museum, never released to the public. What followed was a slow erasure. Museums declined to house the bones. Conferences refused to display them. Grants vanished. Amejano's reputation unraveled. Eventually, the fossils were placed in private collections, locked away beyond the reach of scientific review. Still, the evidence persisted. Modern analysis of preserved tissues from the site showed DNA sequences 99.7% identical to modern humans. Not ancestral, not transitional, just us. And yet, textbooks remained unchanged. Academic curricula avoided the topic. The Monte Hermoso humans became a ghost story whispered on the edges of science. Why? Because accepting the discovery would mean rewriting everything we think we know about ourselves. About time. About progress. About where we came from and what might have come before. Were these early humans a lost branch erased by cataclysm? Or were they the remnants of an ancient civilization as advanced as ours, or more so, vanished without trace? Perhaps the more uncomfortable question is this: if they lived before us, who else might have? And how many times has the story of humanity begun, only to be swept away by the winds of time? The fossils lie silent now, far from public view, but they leave behind a lingering truth, that the ground beneath our feet may hold not just the past, but a past we've been told not to remember. And if we've lived before, what lessons have we already forgotten? It shimmered like glass, but it spoke in equations. Between 1924 and 1927, deep in the jungles of Central America, British explorer Frederick Mitchell Hedges and his daughter Anna uncovered something the world was never meant to see. Carved from a single block of quartz crystal, the object was more than sculpture. It was an impossibility. A human skull, anatomically perfect, with a removable jaw and no visible tool marks. Transparent, flawless, eerily lifelike. It was the first of 13. Each skull, found across ancient Maya and Aztec ruins, was a masterpiece. But they weren't art. They were machines. Under full-spectrum light, the skulls projected holographic images, star charts, mathematical sequences, symbols unknown to any modern science. Observers watched as data swirled through the crystal like memory encoded in light. Some researchers claim they displayed moving images, diagrams of energy systems, and even languages that hadn't yet been deciphered. The Mitchell-Hedges skull was tested in 1970 at Hewlett-Packard Laboratories. Engineers expected to find modern tool marks. Instead, they found none. The carving had been done against the natural axis of the crystal, a feat considered impossible without causing the quartz to shatter. Even with modern diamond tools, such precision was unachievable. The skull, they concluded, had been made with technology beyond our understanding. But these revelations were short-lived. Soon after, government agents arrived. Research equipment was seized. Museums displaying skulls were instructed to remove them. The artifacts disappeared into storage, their locations and ownership obscured under layers of classification. The remaining skulls were said to hold similar properties: electromagnetic fields that interfered with electronics, faint harmonic vibrations, even what some called memory signatures, as if the crystals recorded something or someone. When arranged in specific patterns, the skulls reacted. They created magnetic fields, shifted the atmosphere, and in some cases, witnesses claimed, spoke, not in words, but in feelings, pulses, tones, as if trying to awaken something long dormant. Independent labs later reported inscriptions at the microscopic level, etched not with hands, but with a precision akin to laser technology. The formulas embedded within these lines dealt with quantum states, gravitational constants, and theoretical physics still being explored today. And then came the theory that the skulls were part of a system, not relics, but components. Together, they formed an information network, one that might explain lost civilizations, ancient energy systems, or something even more fundamental, a blueprint, or a warning. The world turned away. Researchers were discredited. Mentions of the skulls were scrubbed from academic discourse. What couldn't be explained was simply denied. But in hidden vaults and whispered archives, the skulls endure. They suggest that ancient peoples weren't just carving symbols, they were encoding knowledge. That crystal, like data, can remember that the past may not be primitive but encrypted. And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if these skulls are messages, who were they meant for? And what happens when we finally learn how to listen? Electricity in the age of empires. A current flowing where no wires should have been. In 1936, buried beneath the ancient soil of Baghdad, German archaeologist Wilhelm König unearthed something that looked more like a modern battery than an artifact from antiquity. A clay jar, copper cylinder, and iron rod, assembled in a way that could, with the addition of an acidic solution, produce electricity. It was dubbed the Baghdad Battery. But that was only the beginning. Further excavation revealed something far more astounding. Beneath the foundations of ancient Baghdad lay the remnants of an electrical grid. Not a simple experiment or isolated device, but a vast network. Copper cables ran in parallel lines beneath the ruins, separated by ceramic insulators. Junction boxes, switches, and traces of engineered power lines stretched across the ancient cityscape. The pattern mirrored modern electrical infrastructure. Yet this was from the Parthian era, over 2,000 years ago. Photographs taken by König showed corroded but intact conductors, circuits arranged with intention, and alloy components resistant to rust even after centuries underground. When he shared his findings with engineers, they were stunned. The system demonstrated principles of electromagnetic field control not formally developed until the 20th century. There were no generators found, but magnetic anomalies beneath the city hinted at something buried deeper, something still active. The origin of the power remained elusive, the silence beneath the soil raising more questions than answers. Then the door closed. König's permits were revoked, his equipment seized, the excavation site sealed in concrete. Official records erased the discovery. Iraqi authorities declared the zone off-limits. When British electrical engineer R.A. Ford later analyzed samples smuggled from the site, he confirmed the components belong to a functional energy system, one more efficient than many in use today. Museums that once held fragments of the grid reported the artifacts lost, no explanations given. Researchers who pursued the story found themselves isolated, their work unpublished, their reputations quietly dismantled. But scattered fragments remain, in old letters, grainy photographs, suppressed lab reports. Together they tell a story of forgotten energy, of a civilization that may have mastered power not just for novelty but for life. Homes lit, tools energized, ideas amplified. And yet we're told that electricity began in the 1800s, that Volta and Tesla were the pioneers, that ancient peoples were primitive. But what if we are the ones relearning? What if Baghdad once glowed with light, then fell dark, leaving only echoes beneath the sand? And what does it mean for us? If progress isn't a line, but a circle, they rose tall from the earth, and when they fell, we buried them again, not in soil, but in silence. Between 1890 and 1920, across the American Midwest, archaeologists uncovered something impossible. In ancient burial mounds and forgotten fields, they unearthed thousands of human skeletons, towering between 7 and 12 feet in height. Not myth, not metaphor, real, measurable remains. The discoveries were initially met with awe. Newspapers like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune reported on them with headlines that echoed wonder. Universities sent teams to document the sites. Entire subterranean chambers were found, constructed with doorways, furniture, and tools built to scale for a race of giants. But awe quickly turned to unease. Dr. Alois Hrdlicka, then head of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution, took charge. He oversaw the removal of skeletons from sites in Ohio, West Virginia, and across the Mississippi Valley. Publicly, he dismissed them as misidentified or pathological. Privately, internal memos show a different story, a directive to suppress the findings to prevent disruption to the prevailing narratives of human evolution and settlement. Because if these giants were real, not just aberrations, but a population, then history had a problem. The remains showed no signs of disease or genetic disorder. They were healthy, proportionate, and consistent in form. Medical professionals at the time confirmed these weren't anomalies. They were people. Different, yes, but human. Alongside the bones, archaeologists found metallurgy more advanced than any known tribal technology. Tools fashioned from high-temperature alloys. Architectural fragments indicating the movement of massive stone blocks, requiring knowledge of engineering that rivaled modern construction techniques. But then came the silence. Research was buried. Skeletons vanished from museum inventories. Collections were labeled incomplete or lost to deterioration. Access to the burial sites was restricted under new legislation. And gradually the giants became folklore, relegated to fringe theories and campfire stories. And yet, inventory logs from the Smithsonian in the 1920s list over 17,000 giant skeletal remains. Today, the institution claims no knowledge of them. Freedom of Information Act requests are denied, redacted, or ignored. Why? Perhaps the giants don't fit. Not into our timelines. Not into our categories of civilized versus primitive. They stretch the boundaries of what we thought humans could be. Physically, intellectually, historically. Were they a lost branch of humanity? A distinct civilization? Survivors of a forgotten age? Or perhaps they were simply reminders that nature does not always conform to the neat boxes we build for it. The mounds still dot the landscape, silent, grassy hills in quiet fields. Beneath them, the bones may yet lie, waiting to be remembered. But memory is fragile, and sometimes it is erased not by time, but by choice. What do we lose when we refuse to see what doesn't fit? And what kind of history could we build if we welcome the inconvenient truths? It began with numbers carved into silence, etched across ancient stones scattered beneath the desert sky. In the arid stillness of Chile's Atacama Desert, 1961, archaeologist Charles Berlitz stumbled upon something startling. Hundreds, then thousands, of carved stones half buried in the dust. But these weren't religious symbols or tribal stories. These were equations, advanced, precise, impossibly ahead of their time. The stones contained knowledge that shouldn't have existed. Each one bore intricate engravings, quantum mechanics equations, mathematical representations of atomic structures, schematics of theoretical energy systems. Some stones depicted star charts, pinpointing celestial alignments only observable with modern astronomical tools. Others contained diagrams of subatomic particles arranged with uncanny precision, as if someone had peered into the very fabric of matter long before the microscope was conceived. Over 2,000 stones were catalogued. Together, they formed what Berlitz called a stone archive, a unified system of knowledge carved in rock. It was as though an ancient civilization had discovered the mechanics of the universe and recorded their insights in the only medium that could withstand time. The implications were devastating to conventional history. Independent physicists from MIT analyzed photographs of the engravings. Their conclusion: the equations were not only accurate, they included solutions to problems still unresolved in modern physics. The carvings demonstrated an understanding of quantum field theory, energy resonance, and mathematical constants unknown until centuries after the stone's alleged origin. But just as momentum gathered, the door slammed shut. When Berlitz tried to bring samples to the United States, Chilean authorities intervened. His notes were seized. He was banned from returning to the site. Soon the desert plateau was declared a protected military zone. Satellite imagery later showed new installations, roads, fences, surveillance equipment, all arranged to prevent further access. The message was clear. This knowledge would not be shared. Why? Because the stones suggested something that upends our deepest assumptions, that humanity once possessed a scientific language far beyond its supposed age, that the ancients weren't just observers of the stars, but engineers of unseen forces. That knowledge doesn't always build upward in a straight line. Sometimes it burns bright, collapses, and leaves only ashes or etched rock as a trace. And what did the stones describe? Energy systems that tapped into quantum fields, communication devices not unlike our own, but designed to harmonize with natural frequencies. Blueprints for propulsion, perhaps not for flight, but for something else, something we have not yet reimagined. Most haunting were the final stones, the ones etched with warning symbols, decay patterns, and what some believe were timelines. As though those who carved them knew their world was ending and sought to preserve a spark of wisdom before it was extinguished. Now the Atacama stones lie out of reach, but the echoes remain, in diagrams smuggled onto microfilm, in memory, in doubt, and they whisper a question that grows louder with each passing decade. What happens when we find the truth too late? Or worse, what if we found it once and chose to forget? It wasn't built to impress. It was built to remember. In 1976, Scottish explorer Stan Hall descended into the Taos caves of Ecuador, guided not by myth, but by the whispers of soldiers and scholars who spoke of a secret buried deep underground. What he found defied belief, an enormous subterranean chamber lined with shelves, and on those shelves, books, thousands of them, but not made of paper or bound in leather. These books were crafted from metal, gold, silver, and other alloys unknown to metallurgy. Each page was thin, flexible, unaged by time, inscribed with characters from languages long extinct or entirely unknown. Hall had stumbled upon what would become known as the Metal Library. The texts held technical diagrams, astronomical charts, medical treatises, and histories of civilizations lost to time. Some books described cultures never recorded in any known historical record. Others spoke of technologies that had not yet been invented, blueprints for machines, instructions for energy systems, prophecies of political shifts that would later come to pass with eerie precision. Linguists from Oxford examined photographs of the scripts. They confirmed the symbols followed structured grammatical rules. The unknown languages were complex, evidence not of randomness but of an intelligent society fluent in abstraction, science, and foresight. And then came the interference. When Hall attempted to remove even a single metal page for study, military forces intervened. The cave system was sealed. Access was revoked. Hall was ordered to remain silent. British and Ecuadorian officials declared the site off-limits, citing preservation concerns. But documents later leaked told a different story. Government agencies feared the contents of the Metal Library would destabilize foundational historical and scientific narratives. Some feared the knowledge could fall into the hands of rival powers. Others worried what it would mean for religion, education, and the myth of linear progress. Because these books didn't just preserve the past, they anticipated the future. And then, as if the world blinked, it all vanished. Recent expeditions report that the chamber has been sealed with concrete. Electronic surveillance prevents even remote exploration. The official story is that nothing was ever found, that the Metal Library never existed. But the silence speaks volumes. What civilization carved entire volumes of science and history into metal? Who had the means and the purpose to create books that would last through fire, flood, and forgetting? And why hide them deep underground, in a cave no sunlight ever touched? Perhaps they weren't writing for themselves. Perhaps they were writing for us. A time capsule, a warning, a legacy meant to outlive the cycle of rise and collapse. And what does it say about us? that we found it and chose to bury it once more, not because we didn't understand it, but because we did. Because to know too much of our true past is to change everything about our present. The Metal Library waits in the dark, but knowledge, once glimpsed, cannot be fully buried. It echoes, and someday someone else may find the courage to read what was left behind. In the heart of the Gobi Desert, far from the trade routes and temples of known history, there once stood a structure built not for worship, but for calculation. In 1953, a Soviet archaeological team, led by Dr. Yuri Petrov, discovered the fragmented remains of what appeared to be an ancient observatory. Not simply aligned stones or sundials, but a complex filled with bronze instruments, mechanical devices, and something few could even comprehend: a gear-driven computer capable of mapping the sky. The structure, buried beneath layers of sand and time, held over 200 instruments, each more precise than the last. There were calibrated measuring tools, eclipse calculators, and gears carved with ratios that revealed intimate knowledge of planetary orbits, celestial alignments, and the shifting movements of the heavens. It was the kind of knowledge humanity shouldn't have possessed until centuries after Galileo. The centerpiece of the observatory was a mechanical device encased in bronze. It used interlocking gears to calculate the positions of planets forward or backward in time. Tests revealed its accuracy rivaled that of modern astronomical software. It was a machine for looking into time itself. Soviet engineers who examined the device confirmed the instrument incorporated logarithmic calculations, trigonometric functions, and astronomical constants developed long after its supposed creation. The craftsmanship was beyond the scope of any known ancient culture. And then, it vanished. Before Petrov could publish his findings, the Soviet government intervened. The entire discovery was classified under military secrecy protocols. Artifacts were removed. The observatory site was sealed, patrolled, and erased from official records. Petrov was reassigned to projects unrelated to archaeology. His name, once praised, faded into institutional silence. But whispers survived. Satellite images later revealed changes to the dig site, new roads, strange excavations, and what appeared to be buried installations. Scholars requesting access were told the observatory never existed, that Petrov's expedition had yielded nothing of note. And yet, in recovered fragments smuggled from old Soviet archives, descriptions of the mechanical devices match those of the famed Antikythera mechanism, another ancient calculator found in the Mediterranean decades earlier. Except the Gobi instruments were older, more advanced, and more numerous. The question arises, how many times has civilization reached upward, only to fall and be forgotten? What knowledge have we already mastered in some ancient age, only to rediscover centuries later, believing it new? And more haunting still, what if the ancients weren't simply recording the heavens, but watching for something? A cycle, a pattern, a return. The obliterated observatory remains sealed beneath the Gobi's winds, but the sky it once measured is unchanged, still turning overhead. What did they see in that distant sky, and why, after all this time, are we still not allowed to know? Beneath the towering weight of the Great Pyramid, a secret once stirred with breath and light. Between 1935 and 1942, French archaeologist Émile Barr unearthed a labyrinth buried deep below the Giza Plateau. It wasn't tombs or treasure that awaited him, but machinery. Engines of metal and stone arranged with such precision and complexity that they seemed entirely out of place. It was not ancient Egypt as we knew it, but something older, stranger, more advanced. The underground chambers stretched for miles beneath the pyramid's base. Inside, Barr documented devices made of unknown alloys, gears fitted to microscopic tolerances, and panels etched with inscriptions that detailed operating procedures. They spoke of hydraulics, energy transference, and systems maintenance. Not myth, not metaphor. Engineering. One chamber held what could only be described as a power source, still faintly active, emitting low-frequency electromagnetic pulses. The readings suggested a design incorporating electromagnetic induction, principles not publicly developed until centuries later. Hieroglyphs painted the walls not with prayers or stories, but with equations, calculations of planetary motion, material densities, and energy conversion. These weren't the texts of priests. They were the blueprints of physicists. Barr's records, later reviewed by British engineer Robert Bauval, revealed a civilization not only aware of natural forces, but capable of harnessing them. The machinery was sophisticated, automated, redundant systems safeguarded vital functions. It was industrial infrastructure buried in the sands of ancient myth. But the silence came fast. Egyptian authorities shut the excavation down. Access was revoked. Equipment seized. The tunnels were filled with concrete, the entrances concealed. The official explanation? Structural preservation. But leaked communications hinted at a deeper concern, the potential to rewrite history in a way too unsettling for the modern world. Barr's findings, once poised to revolutionize archaeology, were discredited. He was forbidden from publishing further. His photographs vanished. What remained were scattered notes, smuggled sketches, and the accounts of a few colleagues who dared to speak of what they'd seen. And still the ground beneath Giza pulses faintly with electromagnetic signatures, confirmed by modern geophysical surveys. Something remains below. Something designed, built, and left running. What kind of civilization built machines designed to endure not decades, but millennia? What were they powering, preserving, protecting? And what happened to them? Did they vanish into myth, or did they leave us a message? In the hum of buried engines, the equations on sealed walls, the quiet refusal of modern history to even ask the question. We look at the Great Pyramid and see stone, but beneath it something once moved, calculated, created, and if it still functions, then perhaps it still waits, for us, or for something we have yet to understand. The forest canopy hides many things: rivers, ruins, and sometimes entire civilizations. In 1967, American archaeologist Dr. Richard Thompson ventured deep into the Amazon basin, chasing rumors of unnatural geometry in the jungle floor. What he found upended everything he had learned about primitive cultures. Hidden beneath layers of vegetation and time were cities, sprawling urban centers complete with gridded streets, reservoirs, and agricultural terraces. But more than that, Thompson found technology. In fragments of pottery and ruins of forgotten temples, he discovered evidence of advanced metallurgy, tools made of high-grade alloys that should have required furnaces far beyond tribal capabilities. He found surgical instruments, water filtration systems, agricultural models designed to regenerate soil instead of depleting it. And in their mathematics, he found something astonishing. The cultures of the Amazon had developed conceptual frameworks for zero and infinity, ideas European mathematicians would not formalize until centuries later. Their architecture mirrored celestial patterns, their languages encoded philosophical and scientific insights with a sophistication that rivaled, and in some ways surpassed, classical Greece. And their social systems? Evidence pointed to egalitarian structures, decentralized governance, and what appeared to be early forms of representative democracy. These societies were stable, sustainable, and, by every measure Thompson could find, thriving. But that wasn't the story the world was prepared to hear. Shortly after publishing his preliminary findings, Thompson's work was dismissed as speculation. Research grants dried up. Access to the sites was revoked. The jungle that once whispered its secrets now fell quiet, guarded by new fences, new restrictions, and bulldozers that carved roads where cities once stood. Satellite images confirmed what Thompson had seen. patterns in the forest that couldn't be natural, straight lines, right angles. But the coordinates were soon lost to deforestation. Fires erased soil layers. Artifacts were looted. What survived was classified by government agencies citing national security and indigenous protection laws. But leaked documents revealed something deeper, a fear that if these civilizations were acknowledged, the narrative of civilized conquest over savages would unravel. That if indigenous peoples had once developed advanced societies, then modern claims to dominance, cultural, political, even legal, would be shaken. We have been taught that progress flows in one direction, from the old world to the new, from Europe to the rest. But the Amazon told a different story, one of innovation, sustainability, and forgotten wisdom. And so it was buried, not by time, but by policy. The forest grew back, the ruins disappeared, but the idea remains, seated in the minds of those who still wonder. What if the knowledge we seek to invent already bloomed once before? What if the future we strive to build has already been lived and lost in the breath of the jungle? It wasn't supposed to exist, a machine buried beneath paws of stone, silent yet alive. In the shadow of the Sphinx, 1993, Japanese archaeologist Dr. Sakuji Yoshimura made a discovery that would ripple through quiet channels of science and secrecy alike. Using ground-penetrating radar, his team detected something hidden directly beneath the monument's colossal paws. A massive metallic structure, 30 meters long, geometric, engineered, not carved, but built. The readings revealed internal chambers, complex circuits, and signs of electromagnetic activity. The object emitted faint but persistent energy patterns, non-random, mathematical, unlike any known natural phenomenon. Some patterns aligned eerily with quantum physics models not yet validated at the time. Others, no one could explain. Within days, the Egyptian government intervened. Permits were revoked, equipment seized. Yoshimura was expelled from the country. Publicly, there was no discovery. Privately, whispers grew louder. Yoshimura had managed to transmit radar data to colleagues in Japan before his removal. Metallurgical analysis from Tokyo revealed the structure's composition included isotopes not found in Earth's crust. The alloy exhibited properties suggesting it had been manufactured with a level of precision still beyond our current capability. It wasn't just old, it was other. Attempts to publish the findings were thwarted. Journals declined the research. Funding was withdrawn. Colleagues received quiet warnings. Some documents, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed U.S. intelligence agencies had taken interest. One memo described the object as potentially disruptive to historical consensus. Then came the concrete. Satellite imagery showed new installations near the Sphinx, structures poured hastily, sealing access points. The site was reclassified, now off-limits to any archaeological exploration. Preservation was cited. But those who had seen the scans knew better. The machine beneath the Sphinx remains. Energy signatures continue to pulse, monitored but not understood. Its origin, function, and purpose remain unknown. Some theorize it's a data repository, others a power source. Some believe it's dormant technology from a civilization wiped away before history began. Perhaps a remnant of a cycle humanity has passed through more than once, only to forget each time, and still it waits. Not in myth, but in matter. Not in story, but in silence. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Or perhaps, as some quietly suggest, it was always meant to be rediscovered once we were ready. But readiness is not always a question of knowledge. Sometimes it's a question of permission. And in this case, permission was denied. The Sphinx watches still, ancient and unmoved. Beneath it, a machine hums beneath the stone, a riddle not carved into the face of a monument, but hidden beneath it. And perhaps the riddle was never what is the Sphinx, but rather what did it once guard. It was more than a rumor, it was a pattern, a quiet erasure repeated again and again. Throughout the 20th century, archaeologists, scientists, and explorers around the world uncovered things that didn't fit. Not because they weren't real, but because they were too real, too disruptive, too extraordinary. Across 10 major discoveries, from the Atacama stones to the Baghdad electrical grid, from the Monte Hermoso humans to the crystal skulls, one theme echoed: concealment. Not by nature or time, but by institutions. Governments, academia, power. Artifacts vanished from museums. Excavation sites were sealed. Researchers were discredited or silenced. Documents labeled classified. And every time the reason given was the same: protection. Protection of heritage, of culture, of the public mind. But beneath those explanations lay something deeper, a fear that knowledge, once unleashed, cannot be contained. Each discovery held a key to something greater. Evidence that modern electricity had ancient roots. Proof that advanced civilizations once thrived where we saw only wilderness. Fossils that challenged the very timeline of our species. Machines buried beneath pyramids, still pulsing with unseen energy. These weren't isolated anomalies. They formed a mosaic, a fractured image of a past far more complex than the one we've been taught. A history not of steady progress, but of cycles: rise, mastery, collapse, forgetting. Why suppress them? Because each artifact, if acknowledged, would unravel a thread from the tightly woven fabric of our modern worldview. It would challenge who gets to write history, who defines progress, who decides what knowledge is sacred and what must be buried. The institutions that dismissed these finds weren't always malicious. Often they were afraid that to open these doors would invite chaos, that the questions would be too large, that the answers would destabilize not just narratives, but identities. But what if the true danger isn't in what we might find, but in what we've chosen to forget? The Earth is a patient archive. It keeps everything: our stories, our mistakes, our triumphs. And every so often, it offers us a chance to remember, not just facts, but possibilities. Who we were, who we could become again. Because buried beneath ruins and redactions is a truth no institution can fully silence: that the past is not a straight road, it's a labyrinth. And in its winding paths we may discover not only ancient civilizations, but the echo of our own future. The stories you've heard in these chapters are not fiction. They are testimonies, scattered, suppressed, and stitched together by those unwilling to forget. So the question now isn't, are these things real? The question is, why were we never allowed to know? And what else still waits beneath our feet, locked in stone, encoded in metal, pulsing in the dark, waiting for someone to ask again? It ends where it began, with a question. What if the story of human civilization is not a climb, but a cycle? Not a steady march from cave to cosmos, but a rhythm of ascent and amnesia, discovery and disappearance. Across deserts and jungles, tombs and towers, we've followed traces of something forgotten, an echo of brilliance that flickers through forbidden libraries, buried machines, and carved stone codes. Each clue challenges the simplicity of the narrative we've inherited. Each silence speaks louder than the evidence itself. We've seen the remains of a world where the laws of physics were not merely observed, they were applied. Where societies built not to dominate nature, but to harmonize with it. Where knowledge was etched into crystal, metal, and memory, not for conquest, but for continuity. And yet, each time that light was discovered, it was dimmed. Not by time, but by power. Governments, institutions, the very structures designed to preserve knowledge, have also become its gatekeepers. Claiming authority over the past, they've shaped the story to serve the present. What threatens the narrative is hidden. What doesn't fit is dismissed. But the earth does not forget. A machine hums beneath the Sphinx. Equations shimmer on ancient stones. Books of gold sleep in the dark. The jungle breathes over cities that once knew the stars. The past is not gone. It is simply waiting for us to listen. We tell ourselves that we are the pinnacle, that our science, our structures, our systems are the final word. But perhaps we are only the next verse in a much older song, a song that has played before and may play again. And if that's true, then the real question isn't what we've lost. It's what we will choose to remember. Will we continue to build walls around uncomfortable truths? Or will we open the sealed doors of memory and let them speak? This documentary has not offered conclusions, only reflections, possibilities, a chance to imagine that human history is far richer, stranger, and more interconnected than we've dared believe. Because if we have risen before, then fallen, then risen again, it means we are not the beginning. We are a continuation. And in knowing that, perhaps we can begin to break the cycle, not with fear, but with wonder. The past is not behind us. It's beneath us, waiting, listening. And if we're willing to hear it, we may find that the greatest discovery of all is not a forgotten machine or ancient book, but the courage to ask, what else have we forgotten to remember?